Okay, so yeah, just keep that right in front of you, and then should be good. Yeah, that's perfect there.
Okay.
Scott, it's very nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Nathan.
Thank you for being here. Your name was given to me a couple times by friends in university, and you seem to be the guy that knows what's up in your areas. So
Well, I hope so.
you work in vaccine development and immunology. Is that correct?
Yes, so I am a professor in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan within the Department of Biochemistry, Microbiology, and Immunology, but I'm also a senior research scientist with the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization, or VIDO.
Wow. What does that look like?
A very different place these days.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the pandemic for everybody has been sort of those defining moments of your life when you sort of look back. It's all sort of pre or post pandemic. And certainly for Vito, the pandemic has changed absolutely everything. That before that, a big part of our priority was in developing vaccines for livestock. That Vito actually used to stand for, the Veterinary Infectious Disease Organization.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But when COVID hit, we were one of the few facilities with the capabilities to be able to work with the virus. So we got called upon to step up and get into that game. And we started to appreciate, I think, as a lot of people and a lot of Canadians did, that scientifically we just weren't prepared to deal with these types of challenges. So one of the things that we've used the pandemic for is to really evolve Vito to be the type of facility that can respond. And it's our goal to become Canada's Pandemic Research Centre. Wow. So yeah, it's been a very dynamic and challenging and exciting time at Vito.
Yeah, I imagine. Is that a provincial organization, or is that?
So we're part of the University of Saskatchewan. We're about 45 years old now.
Oh.
But yeah, no, we're part of the U of S.
Yeah. That must have been quite the gauntlet going into the pandemic. I bet there was a lot of push down and stress trying to get everything rolling.
It was surreal. I mean,
Yeah.
it was absolutely surreal that, you spend most of your professional career thinking about infectious diseases and spending a lot of time of, reading about pandemics. And it's always kind of in the back of your head of, I wonder what it would be like to be a scientist and go through that era. Yeah. And then you see it coming, and it seems a little surreal. And then all of a sudden it's like, holy shit, this is here. This is real. That everybody else is going into lockdown and we're being put on full alert. That we are going to be one of the organizations and the organization in Canada to really have to deal with it. And at the time the pandemic hit, our former director of science had taken over to become the director. So we didn't have a director of science. And obviously going into a pandemic response, you can't have that. So I got asked to step up into that role, and it was one of the most exciting and exhausting points of my career.
I imagine.
But at the same time, I couldn't be more proud of our team and what we did, to see all these people who stepped up and were willing to take on this extra work and were willing to take on these challenges. That even though this is what we're trained to do and you have that infrastructure, I mean, it's scary as hell. Then if you think back to now everybody has had COVID at least a couple of times, and it doesn't seem but at the time when this was just hitting, and I remember when we were getting those first samples being shipped to Vito, and you see the team going into the level 3 to isolate it. And these are your friends. And it's like, oh, be careful. Yeah. But to see everybody rise to the challenge and come together, it was amazing. And it was hard too, that there's stuff you can do for a day, for a week, for a month. But when you step up to that extra level of pace and all of a sudden you're doing it for 6 months, all of a sudden you're doing it for a year, like you start to see the toll that it has on people. But I couldn't be more proud of what we did.
Yeah. Well, I imagine, doing research that intense for that long is probably exhausting.
It is, yeah. And just dealing with all the uncertainty of it too. Yeah. That obviously, developing the vaccines was a very competitive area. But at the same time, you saw scientists from around the world coming together, sharing their results, sharing their thoughts to make this happen. But it was so many groups had vaccines they wanted tested, but there was so few facilities that had the infrastructure and expertise to be able to do it. So they're all coming to us. So you've got this massive list of things to be tested, and you can't possibly do all of it. So you have to go through and you have to start sort of prioritizing of, this seems to have the best chance to work, and this one maybe, goes a little lower on the list, but having to make those decisions and realizing, for a lot of the groups, they've put a huge amount of effort into developing this vaccine or this therapeutic.
Yeah.
And you're kind of looking at it saying, well, based on what I've seen of other things, this one gets priority. We're going to have to look at that one first.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it's probably one of those moments that you train for all your life, and then it comes down to these situations where you're actually making these decisions. And that early in the pandemic too, you were at the point, right, where you don't know what the disease is going to look like in terms of its toll on the planet.
Yeah.
So I imagine that there's probably quite a scale to weigh there, right?
And it was tough too, that you get a lot of people asking you questions, but when you're dealing with a brand new pathogen like this, when you're dealing with vaccines, sometimes the answer was, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to have to wait and see. We're going to have to collect more information. But for a lot of people within the public, that answer of I don't know, wasn't acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also, some of the information that was coming out, it was changing and evolving. And to us as scientists, that's a good thing. That means, all right, we're starting to figure this out. We're starting to figure out the details. But for a lot of the public, it was, well, before you said that, it was like, well, that was based on what we knew then.
Yeah.
This is what we know now. And to make them appreciate that science is a process, that we're not going to have all of the answers right off the hop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was weird. I was bad for that, to be completely honest. I wanted somebody to have the answers, And it seems like, I think what happened to me and what happened to a lot of people is that we just wanted somebody to be omniscient.
Yeah.
I think just someone that can do it all and just help us get out of it. So.
Oh, absolutely. So you would have been a student at the time, so you would have been doing a lot of your classes online. And
yeah, it was weird. It was. I remember seeing on. I actually found out about it on Snapchat, on like some weird Snapchat show or something, and then I remember thinking like, that's whatever. It's like some weird new sickness. Like, who cares? And then it was like 3 weeks later, I got an email. It was like, don't come to school. I was like, oh, okay, this is for real. So,
and I remember, like, you see the news stories, and it seems to be getting bigger and getting closer and closer. And that last lecture I gave, it was in Arts 241, and going to the class saying the university is going to be shut down for the next 2 weeks, but hopefully we're going to. And knowing in the back of my head, there's no way in hell we're back in 2 weeks. But looking out at the students, and I think for a lot of them, that was when it really started to feel real. Like, holy shit, this thing that I've come to love and embrace, and it's such a huge part of my life, is now being shut down. And trying to reassure them, the best you can. I think the words I said was, don't worry, this isn't the one that ends us. We will get through this. You just have to have a little faith and a little courage for the next while. But at the same time, if you would have told me how long we ended up shut down, like, I probably wouldn't have believed that either.
I wouldn't have either, yeah.
And it was, being on campus at that time was just the most surreal experience. That, you would go for a walk in the bowl and there's not another person around. You would go through the buildings and it was like a horror movie. And the times where you did see someone sort of walking in the distance, it was almost like Walking Dead. Like, is that a real person or is that? So yeah, no, it was crazy.
Yeah. And so in Vito, were you developing vaccines there as well, or just testing other people's?
We were doing both.
Okay.
And that was one of the big things too, of how much time do you devote towards your own vaccine and how much you devote towards this more sort of altruistic action, that obviously you want to do all of it, but there's only so many people who are qualified to do this. But we developed the first vaccine candidate in Canada. We had a more traditional subunit type vaccine that we're still moving forward with clinical trials. But the issue we ran into, like, we developed our vaccine very, very quickly. And in animal models, it was doing all the things you would want it to be doing. But the challenge is, if you want to put it into human beings, it has to be produced under certain conditions. It's called GMP conditions, where you can trace back the origins of every component of the vaccine. There's a certain standard in terms of the places that can do it. And there wasn't any places in Canada that could make our vaccine to GMP conditions.
Oh, I see.
So we had to go to other facilities and we had to get in line. And while we were in line is when all the other vaccines ended up getting produced. So, don't get me wrong, I am absolutely thrilled that effective vaccines were developed so quickly. But at the same time, you look at it, and it's like, shit, that could have been
Yeah,
us.
so close.
There could be people around the world, getting a vaccine and thinking like, what the hell is a Saskatchewan, and Googling that.
Yeah.
But that too, I
Yeah.
mean, that, you try to make the best of bad situations. And so we were able to go to the government and say, like, look, Canada could have been an absolute leader in responding to this. But because we didn't have the infrastructure to produce the vaccines, dozens of other groups beat us to the punch. And they agreed. So we then got funding, and there's now a vaccine development facility right within Vito. So
Oh,
we
that's
can
cool.
go from the first idea to a vaccine that's ready to go into a human being, all within the same facility. So it's pretty incredible.
How many laboratories like that exist where you could do start to finish?
Oh, very, very few in the world.
I bet.
And especially when you look at, the different levels of facility, that some places will have level 3 capabilities, but it'll be something sort of the size of this room. The level 3 capabilities we have, we can be looking in large animal models that our level 3 area, it's the size of a football field. Like, it's absolutely massive. So we can do things that very few other labs can do. We also, because we have this background in history in animal diseases, we've got our animal care unit, which is run by veterinarians. A lot of them have PhDs themselves. So we can do things in terms of animal models. So with COVID, that ferrets turned out to be a really good animal model.
Yeah, I heard about that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, so we had the ability to bring in 200 ferrets and repurpose one of our rooms to house ferrets. And our people have the expertise. They know how to work with pretty much anything that walks, crawls, or slithers. So we could do things that very few other labs could do.
Wow, that's so cool. I remember hearing about the university and hearing that we were like right there on top of everything, but I didn't know I didn't know how it worked or anything that about how it looked and the work that was going into it. So it's really cool to hear you talk about it.
It's amazing. And I think one of the things, I mean, I absolutely love Saskatchewan, but I think the people of Saskatchewan sometimes tend to be kind of humble, almost to a fault. And this is one of the things that we can say, like, there is nobody who can do it better than us in Canada. Like, we are the place to do it. Wow. And, obviously you're not cheering for the next pandemic. It would be absolutely fantastic if we never had to encounter something like that again. But we're going to have to encounter something like that again, and probably sooner than a lot of people think. It's nice to know that the expertise and the infrastructure is there, that we went through that experience with flying colors, and for the next one, we're going to be even better prepared. So that certainly gives you a sense of assurance. It's sort of the equivalent. You can't wait until a house is on fire to, all right, let's hire some firemen and let's buy a fire truck. Like, you need that stuff in place. And so we're going to be better prepared than ever.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. Well, I find that on the university in general, I find that a lot of people, like, they don't give it the credit it seems to deserve. 100%. In my opinion, people are like, oh, it's the University of Saskatchewan, or like, whatever. It's just, but I don't know. It's always, to me, I'm like, it's the university. Like, it's a big deal to me, I guess. So,
and it should be. I mean, I think we should be, a bit more proud and a bit more vocal about just how amazing our campus is. And not just in terms of Vito, but in terms of like water security, the College of Agriculture, the College of Medicine. Like, we have got a lot of really cool stuff going on.
Yeah.
And to me, it's always unfortunate that if you'll see a student who gets their degree and, they're saying, oh, I would like to go and now study at Harvard or Princeton, but, I'm from the U of S, they're not going to take me seriously. And it's like, hell yeah, they'll take you seriously. Like, we've got excellent programs here, and our people can compete and succeed on any scale. Yeah. So, yeah, I hope more of our students get a little bit broader in their vision and a bit more confidence in terms of their training.
Me too. I've heard that people underestimate that a lot, actually, how well a degree from a Canadian university looks to an Ivy League school in the U.S. Yeah, I've heard it's actually, I've heard it goes a lot further than people think.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And even within Canada, there tends to be, if you're not at McGill, URT of UBC, like, you're kind of in these Bush League schools, and it's like, no, we're doing some pretty amazing stuff here. And there's certainly advantages associated with those schools, but there's also ones associated with a smaller size, where there's a bit more specialization, where there's a bit more interaction with the professors. No, I'm very proud of the programs we have.
Yeah. Yeah, when I think more people knowing about what actually comes out of the university here would probably help too. People would understand a little bit more. what's
Yeah,
going on.
for sure. No, it's cool to see there's, a bit more of the fundraising campaigns and getting a little bit more, let's sing the praises of what we can do and get people on board with it.
Mm-hmm. And so you said you called it the vaccine that you guys were working on a subunit vaccine.
Yeah.
So that's the traditional one where it's like a weakened or dead version of the this virus that you're trying to.
No, so those would be killed or attenuated, which are also sort of traditional.
Okay.
Subunit means that you're taking one specific biomolecule from the pathogen of interest, and it's usually a protein. You're cloning that, you're expressing that, and you're using that as the basis of the vaccine. So in this case, we were using the spike protein. And when you look at all of the messenger RNA vaccines, I mean, that's what they're coding, the spike protein. So the difference is rather than injecting you with the blueprint, so your body produces the spike protein, we produce the spike protein in the lab, put it in the vaccine, and then put it into you. So it's a bit more of a traditional way to do it.
And is that is or isn't what the mainstream vaccines that came out were
The mainstream vaccines are the messenger RNA or the viral ones. So if you look at the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, those were both based upon taking that blueprint information to produce spike, putting it in the context of these viral carriers, so sort of like a Trojan horse that then goes into your body and delivers that blueprint. And then the messenger RNA ones was just taking the blueprint and just delivering that directly. It's taken up by your cells and the protein produced. So those have the advantage. They're a bit faster to develop, that if you don't have to go through the effort of producing and purifying the protein. So it's not surprising in sort of the grand race to produce a COVID vaccine that the messenger RNA vaccines were the first ones to come forward. But at the same time, that's a new technology, and this by far is, the biggest application and the biggest leap forward for that technology. So it's kind of cool too that, I mean, if you were writing this as a movie, you've got this brand new pathogen that's coming along and it's causing this pandemic, and science responds with something that it had never done before in terms of making these, was what came forward to sort of save humanity. So it adds sort of that extra dramatic twist to what happened.
Yeah, it was so interesting. Did it? How do you feel about it? Did it make you nervous or excited, or just this idea that I guess because these vaccines were the first mRNA vaccines for something this widespread, as far as I know.
Yeah, they're the first messenger RNA vaccines to be licensed in human beings.
Oh, at all?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And it's, was it exciting and was it scary?
Yeah.
Yes. And that's the thing, that if you look through the history of medicine, I mean, it's been said the history of medical advances is written on tombstones, that the things we're working with are so complicated. You don't know with 100% certainty of what's going to happen and how people are going to respond. And we go through all of the necessary steps of the different phases of the clinical trials. So you start just by putting it in a small number of healthy people. And at that point, like, you're not looking at all whether the vaccine works. It's just making sure, like, it's not doing any harm.
Right.
But really, if you put it into 24 people and nothing happens, all you can say with certainty is, on that scale, it seems to be okay. So then you go into phase 2, you look at a bigger group. Phase 3, you look at a bigger group. And obviously that makes sense in terms of, if there are going to be negative consequences, you want to limit how many people are getting exposed to it. But at the same time, there's a huge jump from looking at it even in thousands of people to all of a sudden putting it into millions or billions of people. And when you're talking about human beings, I mean, we're an outbred population. There's a lot of diversity within us. So you can't know for certain what's going to happen over longer time frames and maybe within a small population of those people. And it's really about risk assessment. So you have to look at what's the threat that's presented by the pathogen, and then when you develop your vaccine or therapeutic, what are the side effects associated with it? I mean, obviously you'd want something that's perfectly effective and perfectly safe, but that's quite often not a realistic goal.
Yeah.
And so you have to balance, I mean, what's the dangers of doing something versus the danger of not doing something? And that's going to be dependent upon the disease. That's going to be dependent upon the vaccine. So it's going to be a little bit different every time. And you're trying to figure that out on the fly. So yeah, I mean, it was a scary time, that even as they're rolling out those vaccines, and, to me, when I looked at the risk presented by the disease, as soon as my chance came forward to get vaccinated and to get my family vaccinated, it's like, hell yeah, we're doing it. But at the same time, you have a bit of an appreciation that this is probably going to be causing some adverse reactions in some people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it gets so complicated, is that where does the rights of the population and the rights of the individuals sort of come together? And it's, it's absolutely fantastic. We have different freedoms to choose. If you want to smoke, be a smoker. If you want to ride motorcycles that increase your risk, do
Mm-hmm.
that. But when it starts coming to things where your decisions are going to be impacting potentially the risks of others, that's where it gets so complicated. And to me, that was one of the other huge things that emerged from this pandemic. That you have a pandemic breaks out and science responds in a way of developing safe and effective vaccines with unprecedented speed. That if you would have said to us 5 years ago, a new pathogen is going to emerge and within a year a vaccine will be developed, people would probably laugh at you. Typically it takes like 10 years to develop a vaccine. So that was a huge achievement of science, probably one of the biggest achievements of the last 100 years. But at the same time, you would think there would be ticker tape parades for vaccine development. What we're seeing is confidence in vaccines actually decreased.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost, what the hell do we have to do?
Yeah.
Presented with this grand challenge, come up with something that's safe and effective, saving tens of millions of lives. And yet those issues we faced before now seem to be magnified. And so I think a lot more effort has to go into not just the biomedical science side of how do you develop a vaccine, but also the social science side of how do you get people to make educated decisions about vaccines. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges moving forward.
I agree. I think, hearing you talk about that, I want to say it was really, really nice to hear you speak about it in a more nuanced way, because it seemed like a lot of the times, particularly not as much from the politicians, or not as much from scientists, but more so from the politicians, it heard like we were hearing a lot of like, no, this is perfect, that kind of stuff. So it's nice to hear you speak about it in a way to acknowledge that things are complicated. And but I think that one of the issues with the hesitancy is, I don't know if it's the technology and the vaccines so much as it was you would know more than me, but it seems like it was more them being pushed so hard by people that weren't scientists. I think politicians were really, and they were doing the best they can, and I completely respect that job is extremely difficult. But I think just the fact that it came out so hard with all these mandates, I think that's probably what caused people to be hesitant about it.
I agree 100%, and I think that's one of the things we have to look at. And you're absolutely right about the messaging. It almost seemed everybody got divided into these binary camps. You're either pro-vaccine or you're anti-vaccine. And if you're pro-vaccine, it's like, you will not say anything critical. Like, you've got to be sort of this cheerleader for it. And it's like, well, yeah, in part. But I think that was, blame it on the media, blame it on society of, they didn't want scientists sort of saying, well, we don't know, when, expressing any type of uncertainty. And even how the vaccines were presented, I don't think did us any good over the long run. That I remember going to those vaccine clinics and you would see people coming out and they got their little sticker of, I stuck it to COVID.
Yeah.
And they're strutting out like they're just bulletproof.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, that's not how some vaccines can do that for you. It's rare. What this vaccine means is that you may still catch it, and you probably will, but it's going to keep you out of the hospital and it's going to keep you out of the morgue.
Yeah, you'll be better equipped.
Yeah, but because it wasn't presented to the public in that way, or at least to a lot of the public, then it became a matter of, my aunt got the vaccine and then 3 weeks later, she caught it. Well, that's not a contradiction. And I think that messaging could have been done better. And I think you're right too. Like, in that first wave, it was everybody lining as soon as your chance became available, huge lineups to get it. You heard stories of people like trying to jump the queue and fly to other countries. Great, you're going to get all of those people. And then it's sort of the people, well, if I'm in the neighborhood, I'll get it. And once it's convenient. And then it was the people who, for whatever reason, said like, no, I don't think I want it. And then some of the mandates that came in, historically speaking, that hasn't worked very well. That vaccine hesitancy has been around since the very first vaccine was developed for smallpox vaccine. And as soon as they tried to make it mandatory for people to get the vaccine for their kids, there was typically rioting on the streets. And when the government doubled down and increased the penalties and increased the jail time if you didn't get it, there was just more and more rioting. So I think, some of the things that were done with the best of intentions may have actually had more adverse consequences.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Well, because for me, just like anecdotally, my own experience about it is, I appreciate much more, and I don't know if I'm a good example of the population as a whole, but for myself, I appreciate much more when I'm given the risks and benefits of something, and I'm told to make, just like, we think you should do this, but these are the positives and these are the pros and cons. We encourage it a lot, but it's your decision. Whereas when somebody comes out and says you have to do this, it makes me skeptical of it, because then it feels like I'm not allowed to assess the risks myself. And I'm not a scientist, but it's still like, it's still my body, I guess, my life. So
100%. And you should be able to ask those questions without all of a sudden being branded of you're anti-science, you're an anti-vaxxer. And it's like, no, this isn't that simple. There are people who may get a lot of vaccines, but they have questions about this one. That, is it safe? It was developed so quickly. It's a new technology. It's against a brand new pathogen. Is it reasonable to have questions? Absolutely. And we have to provide the answers in an honest and nuanced way. It can't just be, trust us, we know more about this than you do, shut up and take the vaccine. That doesn't serve anyone. But you saw that too, that there was pressure on the doctors and scientists to always be, presenting the very pro message and not getting into some of the, well, we don't know, but we do know this is the risk if you don't get it. But you also saw on the other side, some of the ridiculous claims that were being made. And that's where I think we can't just treat vaccine hesitancy as one thing. That there's going to be some people that, one of my favorite experiences during the pandemic, somebody would contact me, whether it was a cousin I hadn't seen in 20 years, but they knew what I did for a living. Yeah. And they would say, well, what about this? What about this? And you would have that conversation. And then they would say, you know what? After talking to you, the risks for me of the vaccine are relatively low. The benefits are high enough. It makes sense to get it. I'm going to go get it. But you would talk with other people, and it was clear from the very first sentence, they weren't looking for a conversation. They weren't looking for information. They were looking for confrontation.
Yeah, they want to fight. Yeah.
They want to fight. And, at first it's like, all right, I can be a feisty guy. Like, you want to debate this. But then it kind of got to me like, what are we actually doing here? Like, you're not changing my mind. I'm not changing your mind. At the end of it, we're probably going to dislike each other more than we already do. I just don't see that as a productive way.
And it's not productive, right? I was guilty. I'll be honest. I was completely guilty of that at the beginning. I got so polarized by it. And I'd like to hope, at the beginning of the pandemic, I'd like to say that I became a little bit more accepting. I'm trying to have more and more open-minded conversations about it now, and realize that it just, because when you go into a conversation like that, you don't get anything. The other person doesn't get anything. And you're both just more angry, and nobody's changed their mind. Nobody's had their position. Nobody's outlook has been altered.
And those divides just grow wider and deeper. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing these different, even within Canada, of these subgroups. We hate you because you believe this. And it's like, really? Like, that's not what this should be about.
It makes me sad to see that stuff.
It makes me really sad, actually. And that's what worries me, is that if another pandemic were to come along and we develop a new vaccine for that, what type of environment would we be going into as we're rolling it out? What would be the people who were sort of enthusiastic supporters? What would be the questions? Or is it going to be just sort of feeding down these lines again? And yeah, it's unfortunate. And I'm not even sure how you begin to address that.
Yeah.
That it's one thing if, a person like you says, well, how does a messenger RNA vaccine work? Like, to me, I'm being flooded with the genetic material of a pathogen. Is this going to turn me into it? Like, that's a legitimate question. Yeah. But when you explain it, well, no, it goes from DNA to RNA and protein, and that's happening 1 billion times in your body every second. This isn't that different. Could something absolutely amazing and surprising go wrong? Like, yeah, but the likelihood of that, and we can start to offer some explanations of it. But if you get people who come to you and say, I don't even believe viruses exist, you know, and I've got a guy
Oh my goodness.
constantly harassing me, there's no such thing as viruses. You know, how do you begin to have a conversation? You know, if you're not willing to take 10 minutes and go on Google and read a wiki page and sort of understand, you know, yes, viruses are real. Yeah, you're not looking to better yourself. You're not looking to better the situation.
Yeah.
You're looking to be right.
Well, and that's a person too that can't even like when you have a not even an argument, just but even a discussion, you have to go into it with assumptions that two people can agree on at least a few things that can form the foundation of the conversation. And if you can't even get there, then it's like, hey, why are you even talking to me, right? So,
Well, that's just it. And that's where after a while you started to be a little bit more selective of, you know, which people you would engage in those conversations with. And to me, you know, I love, you know, as you said, you sort of changed your mind. Like, that's exactly how it should be. You know, not just for the public, but scientists as well. That you have to go in this and, you know, this is what I believe now based on this, but I'm going to gather new information and I may change my opinion, and that's perfectly okay.
Yeah. Where does it originate from? Like this vaccine, what was it originally called? Anti-vax. Like, where does that, was there like an original idea of why it was bad? Like not for the COVID ones, but like going way back, or was it just general skepticism?
I think there's a few things about vaccines that work against them. One, they're not traditional medicines, that if you have a headache and I give you an aspirin and your headache goes away, you're going to be grateful I gave you that.
Right.
Whereas with vaccines, if I give you something and then nothing happens, you're going to be like, well, that didn't do me any good. And I got into one argument with a person and he said, yeah, I got a vaccine for this. And then I never even caught that disease. And it was like, that was kind of the point.
Yeah.
So with traditional medicines, you give them to people who are unhealthy to make them healthy.
Right.
With vaccines, you're typically giving it to people who are already healthy to prevent them from becoming unhealthy. So it kind of flips the script a little bit. I think the other challenge with vaccines is that so many of them are given to children. And I think for any of us, you know, do you have kids?
No, hope to though.
Okay.
So.
And it's, you know, your risk tolerance for yourself is one thing. Your risk tolerance for your kids is something different. And getting your kids vaccinated is one of the most important but horrible things you'll go through. And I remember when my oldest daughter, it was time for her to get her shots. And I said to my wife, like, I'm going to be the one to take her to this vaccination clinic. You know, to me, that's something I want to be a part of. And I was in the waiting room and there's the other parents there with their kids. And I was giving this obnoxious lecture on how vaccines work and why we should all be so proud.
That's awesome.
But then you get in the room and the nurse comes with a needle and jabs it in your baby's arm. And your beautiful little baby is experiencing pain and fear for the first time in their life. And they're screaming and they're terrified. And as a parent, that is one of the hardest things you're going to go through. I mean, that just rips your heart out. And then they start getting the next needle ready. And babies aren't stupid. I mean, they're seeing that and they're looking at you like, Dad, kick his ass.
Yeah,
like, what are you doing
Get
here?
him out of here. Yeah.
And some babies get so upset, they pass out from fear.
Oh, wow.
Now, as a parent, like when we left that clinic, I was crying more than my daughter. And you appreciate if you had somebody who had some doubts, had some reservations about vaccines, you know, it would be easy to say like, I'm out of here for this, and this reason, that you start looking for excuses not to do it because it is so miserable.
Yeah.
So I think we have to start too with some of the people who have those concerns, like, what is it about this that you're against? And it has to be an honest conversation. And if you say, I know the vaccines are important for keeping my child safe, but frankly, that experience of listening to my kid scream like that and be afraid, I can't do that. Well, all right, then maybe you should wait in the waiting room and we'll get the nurses to do it. Maybe we need to invest more effort if we can have needle-free vaccines so we don't have to be injecting your kid. You know, is that going to help to address some of those concerns? But until you start having honest conversations about what the concerns are, you're not going to be able to solve them.
Well, I think one of the key points you hit on there is it has to be a question at the beginning. You can't, if you just go in and start telling people like, no, you need to do these because of these reasons, and then this is why it's good. Like people feel attacked, even though you're educating them like factually, but they feel so defensive because they feel like they're being attacked. Whereas if you come at it from that place of, okay, why are you concerned? What are your concerns? How could we resolve your concerns? Those people are so much more open to a conversation in that format than they are to just being told something.
100%. And if you feel like you're being condescended to, of like, oh, your questions are cute, but I have the PhD, so like, no, that doesn't help anybody. And you shouldn't feel judged for having questions. You know, that's a natural reaction to uncertainty, and you should be able to put those forward. So yeah, I mean, I think there was certainly fault in the part of society, but there was certainly fault on the part of the scientists too, that just in terms of all the messaging that goes on. And I think we have to get better at having these types of conversations. That to me, when I look at, it's called scientific illiteracy. So people who, you know, it's not even understanding, you know, can you name all the elements on the periodic table? It's, do you have a basic understanding of how science works? That if we can get people more on board with that, of the pathway and the process of science, of the goals of science, I think we could help to alleviate some of these concerns. But I think the scientists have to do a better job of coming down off of their ivory towers. And, you know, quite often if you're being placed in a position where you're being questioned, or even if you're giving a lecture, that's scary as hell. Like when you're standing in front of 300 people, and it's easy to hide. And, you know, you can hide physically behind the podium. You can hide behind your title of, I'm the professor, I'm the doctor, you know, do not question me. And you can hide behind your words. That you can take relatively simple ideas and think, well, if I, you know, present something that obvious, everybody's going to question, well, what do I need you for? But it's about reaching people where they are. It's not about hiding behind lingo and jargon. It's about trying to speak to people in direct and honest ways.
And honest is so important, right? And people will be less frustrated with you if you're wrong and honest than if you're wrong and just double down, you know?
Yeah.
So
No, 100%.
yeah. It's so important. And I don't know, this conversation is making me really excited. It's glad to hear somebody like in your position speak about these things this way. So
and this, you know, good for you. We need more stuff like this, of getting this information out there. One of the big things I try to do, like when I'm giving lectures in a biomedical science class, you know, you're preaching to the choir that most of those people are already firm believers in science. You got to throw it out a little bit further. Like you've got to be willing to get out into the public forums, to get out into the high schools, you know, to get into social science classes where they may have an entirely different perspective. Yeah. And I think it helps too that if people can see scientists and appreciate, you know, these aren't some sort of weird freaks who hide in their basement twisting their mustaches of like, how am I going to take over the world? Like, I'm not saying we never do that, but I mean, we rarely do that. But to appreciate that, you know, scientists, they're your neighbors. They're the people all around you. And for the most part, the reason they got into this game is they want to help people. They want to make the world a better place.
Yeah. You do quite a bit of outreach that way, right? With secondary education. Yeah. Do you know Tina Ryu?
Yeah.
Did you you've spoken in her biology class a few times, right?
Dozens and dozens of times.
Okay, I think, you know, not that we met, but I think you spoke in my bio class in high school, actually.
That is awesome. Yeah, I'm going to have to tell Tina that.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was one of to me, a really brilliant woman, forward-thinking teacher. If we're waiting until students are in their second year of university trying to convince them to become, you know, a biochemist or a microbiologist, you know, so many kids when they're growing up, that if you're smart and you're coloring within the lines, it's, oh, you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer. They never get, oh, you could be a scientist. Like it just doesn't come up. So I think we need to be speaking to kids at a younger age, to showing them this is what science is about. This is what careers in science are about. So she invited me to come to one of her grade 11 science courses, and I gave a talk there. And to me, it was like, yes, this is what we need to be doing, if not younger, but showing the kids before they start making some of those decisions. So then she set me up with some other science teachers around the city and around the province.
Wow.
And now even around the country. I was just out at the Calgary Science Center.
Oh, that's so cool.
Giving some talks out there. So yeah, it's fun. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, you did a great job. I remember when you came, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. You know, because you have a way of speaking that makes things interesting, you know, because you can get stuck in a lot of times. I think people that are as smart as you are get caught up in not not the ego side of it, but forgetting that other people don't really understand the way they're speaking as much. And so you get into these lectures, and I've had lectures where people lecture on and on and on. I'm like, I know you know what you're talking about, but you're not really grabbing me by this, you know. And you have a really good way of doing that when you're speaking. It's very interesting. So,
But it is bloody hard.
yeah,
Like,
I bet.
I don't think, for most people, public speaking is one of the most terrifying things
Yeah.
they can imagine. And for most university professors, like, you don't get into that gig because you want to be teaching. For most of them, it's because you want to be doing research, and teaching is just sort of one of the things you have to do.
Yeah.
So you want to buy a beautiful house. You don't want to cut your grass, but you have to do it. And I think that's how a lot of professors view teaching.
Mm.
And when you're up there and you're talking about something that means so much to you, like your professional career is based on this, this is where your interests lie. This is, the stuff that keeps you awake at night. And you look at, and there's 300 people, and 299 of them don't want to be there.
Yeah.
They're just taking the course because they have to. It's easy. You want to sort of, when you show the things that mean the most to you, you're showing your unprotected underbelly.
Mm-hmm.
You're exposing yourself to criticisms of the things that you love most in this world. And so I can see why a lot of professors then resort to sort of, hiding behind the title and hiding behind the lingo. But to me, the better defense was if you can go in and say, and be candid and say, I know you don't want to be here. You have my full sympathy. I'm going to try to make this as interesting as possible. And all I ask of you is just give this a chance, and start to show them some of the things why you find it so interesting, to show them the magic that's implied by the formulas and the structures. I think even if they don't appreciate the specific content, I think they tend to respond pretty well to honest passion.
I think so.
And even at the end of it, they say, all right, you didn't convince me to be a biochemist, but I'm glad you found your thing. I'm glad it's going well. Thanks for making it interesting. To me, I'm more than happy with that.
Mm-hmm. I've said this a few times here, but there's few things that are as exciting as listening to somebody talk about something they're passionate about. It's so cool to watch somebody just go on and on and on, and because you just get to absorb all this knowledge from somebody that's excited to teach you about it.
And I love TED Talks. I tend to have those just on the background when I'm working. And when you have somebody out there, they've got 15 minutes to explain why this is cool, why this is important, and you can hear that genuine enthusiasm. Yeah, that's intoxicating. I mean, that's what we're all looking for in life. I describe to my students as looking for moments of certainty. There's a lot of sort of background BS that's going to happen in the world, and you can sort of filter all that out. But if you can recognize and act on those moments of certainty, you're going to have the type of life, you're going to have the type of career that you're hoping to get.
Yeah.
So I think when they see people who have had those moments of certainty and acted upon it, it's cool to see.
Yeah, it's amazing. Another area that I wanted to ask you about is so you work on vaccine technology for diseases caused by misfolded proteins.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, is that similar to what the other vaccines are, or is it completely different?
No, it's completely different. The reason I got into the vaccines for the protein misfolding diseases, and that includes, prion diseases. I don't know if you've heard of chronic wasting disease or mad cow disease, as well as some of the sort of less exotic but sort of equally important, that if you think of things like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's or ALS, they all have a common mechanism associated with them, where it is a self-protein that is going to fold into an alternate conformation. So proteins are linear strands of amino acids, and it's kind of like a sentence, that sentences have different lengths and different words give them different meanings, that different strings of amino acids have different amino acids, which give them different structures, different functions, different meanings. And the classical interpretation was when you had a polypeptide chain, there was one and only one way that it could fold to get biological activity. What we saw with the prion diseases is that it can fold into a different conformation, a different pattern that has different characteristics. And here the characteristics are that it's pathological, so it's going to kill the neurons in your head, causing fatal, untreatable neurodegenerative disorders, but also that they're self-propagating, so infectious. that when the misfolded form encounters the properly folded form, it causes it to misfold.
Wow.
So you can get this cascade of misfolding events that are going on. So it's this entirely new paradigm of what infectious diseases are, but it's starting to look like we can, even though it's this new form of infection, we can still develop vaccines for them.
Wow. And so, why does a protein have to fold? Like, why is it actually just to take up less space? Or
No, it's what it does in terms of its biological function is very much dependent upon the three-dimensional presentation of the protein. So it has to fold a particular way to have activity. So if you wanted to take this piece of paper, if I wanted to make this an origami chicken, or if I wanted to make one of those Foursquare things, if I wanted to make a paper airplane, I have to change the shape of it for it to be able to perform those functions. So it's this very strong relationship between protein structure and protein function. But it wasn't appreciated just how complex these structures can become. And I mean, with the prion disease is the other, absolutely amazing thing about it, that one of the things I love in science is a good story. In virtually every aspect of science, if you dig far enough, you're going to find heroes and villains and brilliance and blunders. But there's no better story than the prion diseases. And what I love about it, it's a story that we're living in real time. And it's not winding down to some gentle, inevitable conclusion that we have no idea how this is going to end. And it started at the end of World War II, where the eastern half of New Guinea came under Australian control. And they started to send in all their diplomats to sort of look around and say, well, what exactly do we have here? And reports started coming back of this strange disease that the local people called kuru, which meant trembling with fear. And how kuru presents itself, it starts with a loss of coordination. So maybe you stumble a little bit when you're walking. It eventually reaches a point where you can't stand up, so you're just sitting on the ground. Then it reaches a point you can't even do that. You're just laying immobilized on the ground. And as you're losing control of your body, you retain control of your mind. You know exactly what's happening to you, and you've seen enough other cases of this to know that kuru is 100% fatal. Now, while you retain control of your mind, the one exception is that the patients of kuru would go through prolonged bouts of uncontrollable laughter. So you're lying on the ground, paralyzed, knowing you're about to die, and you're laughing hysterically.
Wow.
So, absolutely terrifying disease. And so the doctors and scientists showing up of like, what the hell is this? Nobody had seen anything like that before. And it didn't seem to be sort of a classic infection. It didn't seem to follow sort of genetic lines, that it was just running through families. It didn't seem to reflect any exposure to environmental toxins. So even after years of study, they had no idea of what was causing it. And then they got a clue. They did what frustrated scientists do. They went to the bar and they were having a few beers, and there was some of the locals around. And they mentioned, like, did you know those tribes you're studying, they're cannibals? And at first, they were like, that's quite often an accusation that's put forth against societies that are viewed as being primitive. It's a way to dehumanize them. And they went back and said, oh, we heard the craziest story about you guys. They think you're cannibals. It's like, yeah, we are.
Yeah.
And it's not as bad as it sounds, that they viewed it, when you died, they could bury you in the ground and you would be eaten by worms. And they thought it's better to be eaten by the people who loved you than to be eaten by worms. And it's like, yeah, okay, I guess
fair enough.
Kind of makes sense. And the specific ritual that the recently deceased were eaten by the women and children of the tribe. And lo and behold, it was the women and children who were getting kuru. So right away, there was this sort of seeming link between it. But the lead scientist, a guy by the name of Carlton Gaidowski, he didn't want to believe that this was something that was being spread through cannibalism. And his belief was, he said, well, there's other tribes that we know are cannibalistic and they don't have kuru. Therefore, that can't be the cause of it. He said, something as extraordinary as kuru demands an equally extraordinary explanation. And so he resisted doing the experiment of taking some of, the material from kuru patients and trying to feed it to an animal. Could you transmit the disease in that way? And he resisted doing that for years and years. And finally, there was enough outcry from scientists around the world saying, like, do the damn experiment. that he took brain material from an 11-year-old Kuru victim, a young girl, and put it into chimps. And lo and behold, they came down with a disease that looked an awful lot like Kuru.
Oh, wow.
And that was the first demonstration that it could be transmitted, that it was an infectious disease. So for that experiment that he was so reluctant to perform, he ended up getting a Nobel Prize for that. So very
Wow.
much sort of right place at right time.
Yeah, no kidding.
And then when they started to look at, all right, it's infectious, but what is it? And they subjected it to treatments that would kill viruses or bacteria of different chemicals and UV light. The prions just kept going and kept going. They filtered it out that bacteria are bigger than viruses. They put it through filters that will take out any of those things. And it was smaller than any known virus and completely resistant to anything that should kill a bacteria or virus. And that's when people started to get this idea, this isn't a traditional infectious agent. And there was one guy by the name of Stanley Prusner who was willing to shout what other people were whispering. It seemed to be caused by a protein. And he was able to identify the specific protein that was causing disease. And once we know the protein, it's relatively easy to backtrack to find out what the gene encoding it is.
Okay. Yeah.
And so when they looked in people who had Kuru, like lo and behold, they found that gene, everything seemed cool. But then they looked into people who were healthy, who didn't have Kuru, and they also found that gene. And Stanley Prusner admits, he said, it was the longest night of my life. I thought I had made a terrible mistake, but it turns out he hadn't. That it's the gene produces the same chain, and it can fold in one of two ways. And making that discovery completely changed how we thought about proteins and how we think about infectious diseases. And that won Stanley Prusner the Nobel Prize.
Wow.
And when he put forward this paper, putting this idea that Kuru is being caused by this misfolded protein, he also had this line at the end of the abstract, sort of the introduction of it, saying we may see similar mechanisms in other diseases like Alzheimer's, ALS, and Parkinson's.
He was on the ball.
Well, and a lot of people said, like, whoa, Stanley, like, you're putting out an idea that's going to win you a Nobel Prize. Like, why are you pushing it further?
Yeah.
And some people would say, like, your reaction, like, he was just that much of a genius and he was that visionary that given a glimpse of this, he was able to see this far. Other people say, if you're trying to get funding to study a disease that's happening in cannibalistic tribes on the other side of the world, you're not going to be able to get a lot of funding dollars for that. If you're talking about Alzheimer's, ALS diseases that are impacting huge members or huge populations within developed nations, it's going to be a lot easier to get funding.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So it may have been a little bit of both, but he turned out to be right, that those diseases are caused by the misfolding of other proteins within the body to take on this self-propagating form.
Wow.
And understanding that mechanism now gives us more rational ways to be able to develop vaccines for those diseases.
That's incredible. And so when you have these proteins, can they fold only in one of two ways? Like, can they have their proper function and a misfolded? Is that the only two options, or is there like one that can do like 100? Or...
Yeah, and now we start to appreciate there's a class of proteins called the inherently disordered protein structures. And that's where it becomes so complicated, that when you think about something like drug design and you see the picture of a protein in a textbook and it's this very elaborate structure and you design drug molecules based on that, but then you start to appreciate, like, you just got one snapshot of this thing, that it can change, it can morph, it can take on different conformations. Wow. It's like you're shooting at smoke. You know, how do you begin to... And that's sort of typical of science, that anytime we think we've got something figured out, you start to appreciate there's levels to this game. There's stuff going on that you can't even begin to appreciate in terms of its complexity. So yeah, proteins that can adopt different conformations in different situations to do different things, absolutely.
Wow. I want to touch on two quick things before I let you go here, because we're just about at our time here. But so
fast.
Sorry?
That went fast.
Yeah, right. It flies by. But so if a misfolded protein causes other proteins to misfold, why is the disease not like, I guess why does a prion disease not completely degenerate a brain like overnight? It
takes time, and even with things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, that By the time you start showing symptoms, that misfolding process has probably been going on for years and decades. It just has to reach sort of a critical enough mass for it to start having its impacts. So this isn't like one misfolds and then all of them just instantly. It's going to be a slow process.
Okay, so
And that's why the prion diseases, that's one of the reasons they're also so hard to study is, so when we talk about the latency period, that's the period in between when you were exposed and when you show symptoms. So if I was to sneeze on you right now and 2 days from now you come down with the sniffles, you're going to be going like, damn that guy.
yeah.
Like, but if I was to, touch your hand and 10 years from now you come down with some sickness, you're not going to be thinking back. We have a harder time sort of understanding those types of diseases. And then when you're trying to develop treatments, that every time we want to test one of our vaccines, it's all right. You vaccinate the animals, you infect them, and now you wait 2 years. So it makes it a lot slower process. So it doesn't proceed as quickly as sort of classical infections.
Okay, I see. And then my next question was, how do you, like, I know this is a really deep topic, but how do you develop a vaccine for something that, like, how do you cause the body to protect itself against that?
And that is a brilliant question. That's the hardest part. That anything within your body is protected by something called immune tolerance. Like your immune system is geared to recognize and fight foreign entities, foreign particles. But when it's part of your own body that works against you, the immune system doesn't raise any type of reaction to it. And even as we're trying to develop a vaccine to trick your body into, recognizing this as being a threat, we have to fight against that immune tolerance. So as people started to identify different antigens, different targets within these proteins, and were trying to develop vaccines, they were having absolutely no success. That they would take that, they would put it into the body, and the body just says, oh, this is meant to be here, no immune response. And it was a fellow by the name of Dr. Neil Cashman at UBC who had identified a number of really promising targets. But no matter what he did in terms of carrier proteins and really harsh adjuvants, he couldn't get the immune system to respond to it. And he happened to be at a conference where Lauren Babiak, who was the director of VITO at the time, they happened to bump into each other, and Neil sort of mentioned, if only there was some way to get strong immune responses against these self-peptides. And Lauren, with his history in developing vaccines, said, we actually have a platform that can do that.
Wow.
Because we were looking at developing a vaccine to immunocastrate livestock, that if we could develop immune responses against peptides that are involved in reproductive development, we could stop that process. So a lot of that technology had been developed. And that's where my involvement started, that they started talking, and Neil said, all right, I'll provide you the targets. You can apply some of your technologies, and we'll see if we can make this work. I had just started at VITO. That was 20-some years ago. We got started on this. Wow. I'm a protein biochemist by training, and they knew I was interested in prion disease. So they're like, you want to take this on? And it was just, hell yeah. Like, that is one of the most interesting and important challenges I could imagine.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so if I'm understanding the path correctly, it's looking at a way to cause the body to stop producing proteins that misfold instead of...
It's a way, what we're doing right now is that when the proteins misfold, they all sort of stack on top of each other in this amyloid structure. So you're going to have this long tube of the misfolded proteins. And then when the healthy form of the protein comes along and encounters that, and it causes it to misfold, and it gets layered on the stack. And it's both because you're losing the healthy conformation as well as gaining this unhealthy conformation. We're trying to develop antibodies that essentially cap the ends of it so that the properly folded can't get incorporated into that. So it wouldn't be a cure yet. What this would be is a way to stop the disease from progressing. So even if you imagine something like Alzheimer's, that if we could go in at sort of the first indications, that there may be some dementia, and to be able to give you these vaccines and say, you know what, as bad as you are now, that's as bad as it's going to get. That this isn't going to be something over the next 7 years, you're going to show this, horrific decline. It may be you're still going to have the disease, but in all likelihood, you're going to die with the disease, not from the disease, and you're going to be able to retain your memory, your cognitive function for longer. That's the goal for now.
That's amazing.
That would be. I mean, if you've ever gone through the experience of a family member or a friend who goes through dementia, I mean, it's one of the most horrific experiences you can imagine. So yeah, if we can do something to have a positive impact there, that would be absolutely incredible.
Yeah, no doubt. Wow. Well, was there anything that I didn't bring up that you wanted to cover real quick? Or?
No, this was absolutely amazing. No, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Can you let people know where they can find you if they want to reach out to do research or get involved or just read your research?
That they can go to the Vito website. All my information, my phone number, email address is listed there.
Perfect.
Yeah, be happy to have these conversations with them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.